Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by wealthmanagement.com senior editor David Lenok.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of wealthmanagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to their more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that can just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. Our guest this week is Kelley Wolfington. Kelley is a senior wealth strategist at SEI Private Wealth Management. She provides holistic advice in the areas of trust and estate planning, wealth transfer, philanthropy, succession planning, tax planning, and family communication and education strategies for ultra high net worth and high net worth individuals and families. Thanks so much for joining us, Kelley.
Thank you.
Now, the subject of today's episode is a bit of an offbeat one, Vince McMahon Sr. Vince Sr. was an American professional wrestling promoter. He's best known for founding and running the Capital Wrestling Corporation, later renamed the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and subsequently shortened to the World Wrestling Federation, though today we know it as WWE, and he ran it from 1953 to 1982. The son of a successful Harlem-based boxing and concert promoter named Jess McMahon, Vince Sr. took up the family trade. Though Jess dabbled in wrestling, Vince Sr. saw great potential in the maligned industry even then to offer cheap and consistent programming for this newfangled invention called television. And he parlayed his father's existing relationship with legendary Madison Square Garden promoter Tex Rickard to give his fledgling company and its array of ethnic stars designed to appeal to a diverse city of immigrants a spot on the grandest possible stage. Now, despite its name, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation was, like all professional wrestling promotions of that era, mostly a regional operation. For those who aren't aware, for most of its history, American professional wrestling was based on a system of territories. Each territory was basically a family business owned by a certain promoter, and there was a basic handshake agreement amongst them all that they wouldn't infringe on each other's turf, basically. The WWF was simply the one that came to dominate the most lucrative region, being the Northeast. The wrestlers themselves largely traveled fairly freely amongst the various promotions, with the promoters openly exchanging talent. And this actually resulted in wrestling becoming an intensely family-based industry, because after all, who can you trust most to stick around for the long haul in an otherwise nomadic profession? Your kids. So it was very common for the family of the promoter to hold starring roles in their respective territories, with one notable exception, the Northeast, where Vince Sr. believed that a promoter's role was to remain in the background and not be seen. He also strongly believed that wrestlers shouldn't cross over into other media, but should remain in wrestling to protect the legitimacy of the sport, which was, of course, anything but. These beliefs are important because in 1982, Vince Sr. sold the company to his son, Vince Jr., who is the Vince McMahon most folks know today. Vince Jr. had much grander aspirations than just running a regional wrestling promotion and very different ideas about the sport than his father. In an interview with Sports Illustrated in 1991, he said, "Had my father known what I was going to do, he never would have sold this stock to me." Now, Vince Jr. immediately broke ranks with the other promoters and started promoting and broadcasting shows all over the country behind the strength of his new star attraction, Hulk Hogan, a man initially made famous by his star appearance as Thunderlips in Rocky III. He gradually drove the other promotions out of business and built the then WWF into a juggernaut, scooping up the biggest stars from around the country under one banner. He completed his ascension to dominance at the turn of the 20th century by putting himself on screen as the villainous Mr. McMahon, the main antagonist to Stone Cold Steve Austin, and that gave rise to the most lucrative and culturally relevant period in wrestling history. He turned the now WWE, after a hilarious lawsuit from the World Wildlife Fund, from the biggest cog in a regional wrestling machine into a multi-billion-dollar company that is basically the whole machine. So why have I spent the last 5 minutes just prattling on about professional wrestling of all things? Like many topics on this show, if you strip away the silliness and the pageantry, there's a relatable core to the story. The next generation having different values than the older one. So I chose this example in particular, as often when we discuss this topic, it's really easy to fall into this idea of failing to pass down certain values, which, inherently implies that one generation's beliefs are more valid than that of the other. In the case of the McMahons, there's no clear good or bad. Some may look at Vince Sr.'s willingness to work with the other promotions despite his many advantages and his views about nepotism in the industry as a whole as somehow noble, while others may look at what Vince Jr. was able to do with those same advantages and just fewer qualms and say that his way is definitively better. Ultimately, it's never that simple, and the concept of passing on values from one generation to another is thorny ground that any advisor to wealthy families must contend with. So, Kelley, what's an advisor's role in helping pass on certain values? And what happens when it becomes clear that the next generation is headed down a different path than the previous?
I would say that the advisor's role in transferring values really is, it starts with communication. So it's wonderful that families want to pass on wealth to their children, grandchildren, future generations. But if they're not telling their children their story and how they got to where they are, then those values do get lost. And it's really important to really have those conversations. So I can tell you here what we do in terms of family communication is trying to dig out the history, of the family, of the wealth. We have a lot of first generational wealth. So these family members generation one may have been entrepreneurs or business owners and generated the wealth, significant wealth behind them themselves. And they didn't have the same upbringing that their children did. So it's really important to tell stories. We're a big believer in stories because that helps the values transfer, at least in terms of having generational divides understand each other. And when we see clients, children that may not have the same values, it's not our role to try to explain to them how they should have the same values. More, it's trying to find the common thread. So the generational divide is real. How I was brought up is different than how my parents were brought up and how I'm raising my children. And you can even see a divide within families that have multiple children. My upbringing is different than both of my sisters' upbringing. So it's again trying to find what is the history, what is the story that we're trying to tell, and how do we find what may be similar so that you can actually respect each other, because that's key. Family dynamics are never easy, but there should be some underlying respect behind them.
Yeah, it's a very difficult balance
Yes.
to try to strike, right? I've spoken, with other guests I've had on the show. I had Mitzi Perdue, Frank Perdue's wife, on the show, and her family literally hands down a bronze casting of like what the family is about to the next generation as a gift.
Yes.
And that works for them. But that's also sort of a very bright line example of, well, if this doesn't work, you could see how this could rub somebody the wrong way if they don't happen to have bought in necessarily to what this is all about.
Most definitely. That becomes fraught with emotions and a sense of responsibility. And if you're not ready for it, or if you don't want it, that becomes problematic. So when you have a family that communicates well what their goals, what their values, what their objectives are, that's how you can kind of bypass or help to alleviate the anxiety that comes with significant wealth. I can't imagine as an 18-year-old getting something like that from my family.
10 commandments, right? Sort of literally handed down from on high.
Yes. All of a sudden, you would think of it almost as, back in the days of royalty when kings and kings were made kings at 14 years old. It's just, that is a huge burden that you're laying on somebody. So if you start to have those conversations early and often, I feel as though that becomes a lot easier as the time comes.
Yeah, and I think those conversations also play a great role in sort of reminding everyone that values are more malleable than they seem.
Yes.
And these things aren't as black and white necessarily. I know, especially in the current political climate, we see that a lot of times people can sort of be cutting their nose off to spite their face to sort of not flip-flop or just take a stand because this is what I stand for. It's like, okay, but pushing a little in either direction to make other people happy or to sort of try to understand and relate to others is realistically the way that humanity should kind of work. And in these families, it's the way to maintain this a current. There can still be a thread line of related values that aren't necessarily the exact same company line.
Yes, they don't. To your point, there are a lot of grays around values. And while you may have a sticking point on something, you can still find a commonality with somebody that's the complete opposite of you. And I think that I would agree with you, in today's current political environment, we are really seeing that, where the middle of the road or the grays around that are there. You just sometimes have to dig a little bit for it.
So, and obviously we're using values here, which is, I think, a purposefully nebulous term that can apply to just about anything that a family holds dear. It could be,
yes,
as in the Vince McMahon's example, sort of their opinions about specifically the professional wrestling industry, or it could be something as what I think more commonly we'll see it in, what sort of philanthropy or causes that one generation cares about versus the next, and you can fall into these situations where a lot of time we see this with sort of dead hand control issues, also where the one generation sort of letting perfect be the enemy of good and what they're passing on and trying to get a little too granular in exactly what that value is, when really sort of the broader strokes are the important part.
That's correct. When you are talking about multiple generations, certainly whether it's philanthropy or otherwise, philanthropy is it's an easy way to discuss values. It's an easy way to quantify it and help families really have those conversations because you're helping others. What's better than, how else do you feel good than when you help others? So in terms of those multiple generations and the disparity between them, values, again, it goes back to it is a gray area where one family member might be very religious, the other is very community driven, but maybe not towards a specific religion or specific synagogue or church or whatever it may be. And so it's really important to bridge that gap and find why is religion or why is this specific community so important? And usually there is an overarching theme to it that's come down from grandparents, great-grandparents, family friends. And again, once you find that common thread, that commonality, then it really does become easier to have the conversations with the family members.
So with all this communication that has to happen, it all seems very personal. Where does the advisor really enter this whole program? Because with a lot of these families, this communication, though it may eventually become second nature, starting it generally has to be pretty intentional.
Yes, it does have to be intentional. Typically it is an iterative process. And the way that the way that advisors can start it is by asking questions, whether it's with G1 or G1 and G2, but asking questions, delving into some of the family history, because frankly, people like to talk. So once you start to ask questions, then usually our clients are very open and willing to discuss it. And it's funny because whether it's generation 1, generation 2, or generation 3, they usually are more comfortable discussing it with an outsider than they are with somebody that's in the family. Because again, the different upbringings in the same family or the family members look at it differently. So I found that by asking questions about a history, about a money message, that's where they feel more comfortable. Here at SEI, we do a lot of things that are gamified. So we have a discovery mode where we use it to really talk to clients about goals and objectives. And it's in a more interesting and fun way than checking a box about asset allocation and general market overview. And it's very similar when we're talking about values transfer, that there are a lot of tools out there that advisors are able to use, whether it's an internal tool or an external tool that just opens the conversation. So it could be cards. It could be an app. There are a lot of things that are out there that we have access to. And it makes the conversation flow in a freer manner than just asking, what are your values and how do you want to pass it down?
It's really interesting, this idea of sort of the advisor as a mediator or a double agent, almost sort of flitting between the two parties to try to find this middle ground. And I think in that, it's important for advisors, especially those who may be advisors, started as the advisor to the wealth creator, to determine, when you ask this is a difficult question, who is my client, right? Because you can, especially if you came up as sort of dad's advisor, mom's advisor, she's the one who built the company, and everyone else in the family hasn't really met you that much, but they're still dependent on you as their financial advisor. You kind of find this interesting, as you transfer from a person's advisor to advising now family generational wealth, there is that question you have to realize, I am the family's advisor. I am not, Mary's advisor necessarily.
Oh, definitely. Once the children start to get involved, our goal and our job is to be impartial. So it's fine to explain where a parent might be coming from or where a child might be coming from, but we can't take sides. And so it's really important to make sure that we do look at it in an impartial, colored lens, and really make sure that when we're part of those conversations, that it's more of a listening and repeating. So it's not putting our views in there. It's not saying what we think we heard. It's literally saying, this is what we have heard, and this is what G1 says, this is what G2 said. And it's trying to make sure that the family members hear each other as well.
A lot of times we talk about sort of communication, and I mean, anyone who's really listened to this show will note that communication is effectively the theme of every single episode.
Oh, yes.
But hey, don't tell anybody. But I think a lot of times we talk about these communications. I think family meetings sort of come up as the general catch-all of like, oh yeah, these are great. What are your feelings on family meetings, and sort of what role should an advisor play in them? Should they just sort of schedule them and then step aside, or should there actually be like an active mediating sort of organizing role while it's going on?
Oh, I think our job is to figure out, well, what's the objective of a family meeting? If you want your family to get together, then what's the purpose of it? And this goes back to including all of the family members and really saying, okay, we can come up with a family meeting and to go over investments, to go over the portfolios, to go over what your philanthropic activities have been in the last year, 5 years, 10 years. But is that moving the needle for them? Is that helping them in any way? And as an advisor, our job is really to figure out what are we trying to get out of the meeting, and how can we help our clients get to where they're telling us that they want to be.
And I guess that gets back to the intentionality of the whole process that needs to be involved, right? I mean, anyone who's ever seen the show Succession has seen like the million family meetings, and they're like, oh, we'll go to therapy, sure, but they never actually determine what they're going to therapy for, other than that they're awful.
Right.
And then it goes predictably as sort of poorly as everything on that show goes.
There's no doubt. I mean, if you're going into a meeting without 1, 2, or 3 objectives, then it's just a free for all. And what good is that?
And a lot of times in those free-for-alls, I think you'll see the family sort of fall back into sort of the respectful roles, right? Where sort of the patriarch will do all the talking, and then the kids will turn back into children, assuming they're, a lot of times when we're talking about kids here, we're talking about 40-year-olds. But they will turn back into 12-year-olds because mommy is talking.
Right.
And that's a very, destructive dynamic to have. And that's sort of the opposite of what a family meeting should really go like.
Definitely. And it's really interesting too, because as you're talking to clients over the years, you hear them say something, and then when you see them with their children or grandchildren, they're acting in a different way than what they've expressed how they want to be. And so it's really trying to take a step back and lead them to the path that they've already told us that they want to be in.
Well, I guess that's an interesting question, right? I mean, when you see that, what do you give more weight as the advisor? Because you're doing a little bit of deciphering yourself, right? Where like, is the path they want what they told me when nobody was there to hear? Or is what the way they are with their children now in the moment showing me what they actually want? I mean, that seems like it's a very tough distinction to suss out.
Oh, it definitely is. And I also feel that it's very situational. And it's not something that you ever want to call a client out on in the middle of a family meeting or in the middle of a meeting, but it's something that can be discussed, whether you pull them aside or you talk about it at a later date. And again, when you have that impartiality, that's the important part of it, so that we are their advisors. We are saying, this is what we've heard. You've told us this, and this is what transpired. So we can either try to find a different way to get there, or we just have to have another discussion about what really are you trying to accomplish.
So I think, for many advisors, if they could get it to this point, they're pretty comfortable in sort of trying to navigate the rolling ball. But
Yes.
Getting the ball rolling is very difficult for a lot of people. And specifically sort of getting the ball rolling with that next generation who's not the client you're seeing 4 times a year.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that, and how sort of go about sort of getting over that speed bump of just making any sort of positive contact with the next generation, so you're not just some guy in a suit who shows up at dad's funeral?
Yes, that is the most important thing as an advisor, is that there's a huge shift of money that is coming our way, and to make sure that we have connections with the next generation for a number of reasons. But most importantly, it's for the clients and their families. If you feel that you're doing a great job for the parents, and you want to continue to do a great job for their children and grandchildren, well, then you need to meet them where they are. And the way that we really started is we have educational material that we talk to our clients' children about. We talk to them about family gifting, about philanthropic gifting. I have some clients where the parents give a certain amount of money, donations, but the children have to have the conversation with me so that the kids are making the decisions, but in a meaningful fashion. So talk about what philanthropy means. What are you supposed to be looking for? Other children, I have educational meetings so that we can level set. So when we're talking about family meetings, it's also important that everybody understands what's being discussed. So giving everybody the opportunity to be educated so that they feel comfortable when we're in those meetings. And the more face time that you have with the next generation, G1, G2, G3, the more face time that you have with them, the more comfortable they are coming to you with questions. And so that they look at you as part of their team, as opposed to just their parents' advisor.
So, Kelley, thus far we've sort of been talking about the case, hopefully where, there is some common ground,
Yes.
and that the advisor can make meaningful connections here. But that's not every case, unfortunately. And so there is a situation where we have 2 generations that just are going in completely opposite directions. What is the advisor's job and role then?
When we're talking about children, quote unquote, that are in their 40s, they're adults. Mm-hmm. So the advisor's job is to listen to what their clients are saying. So their clients are not just the parents. They are also their children or their grandchildren. And so it's going back to, you are my client, just like your parents are my client. So I need to follow what your guidance is. I need to follow what your objectives are. And especially where wealth has already been transferred, that certainly makes it easier. But most of our clients that have trust for their children or their grandchildren, they've already laid out what their intentions are. And it's up to the children to say, these are my intentions, these are not my intentions. I want assets for something different. And it's up to them to be honest with us so that we can figure out whether or not what we're looking to do makes sense from the holistic standpoint.
Well, that's about all the time we have. I'd like to thank Kelley Wolfington for being just a great guest and for tackling what is an enormous and broad topic with me. Thank you so much, Kelley.
Thank you, David. It was a pleasure.
And for all our listeners, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of InformaWealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.